Comedians are like anthropologists in that they both study culture and report back on it. They're a cultural critic. So, anthropologists typically study foreign cultures, often belonging to the past, and they explain the foreign culture to members of their own culture. An anthropologist studies a culture, then reports back to explain it, usually not to members of that culture. So, for example, a British anthropologist may go to New Zealand to study an indigenous culture there. And then once they're done studying that indigenous culture, they'll go back home to Britain or Western academia in general to explain the symbols and functions of that indigenous New Zealand culture. A stand-up comedian, however, studies their own culture and explains it to fellow members of their culture. So, for example, an African American experiencing racial discrimination and then expressing their experience to fellow Americans. They're opening up a space for self-reflection. So comedians study their own culture in the present and explain it to fellow members within that culture. The anthropologist is a sympathetic outsider, whereas the comedian is a cynical insider who approaches their own culture from an outsider's perspective. Because you need that fresh perspective of someone who's an alien to that culture in order to remove all the pre-existing unconscious biases and shed a different light on something that's always been looked at the same way from those within that culture. Comedians are anthropologists of the present. They are able to see things in their own culture at the present moment as if they were an outsider who can observe these things from an unfamiliar perspective, one that hasn't already gotten used to how things are. Because if you get used to everything around you, then you're not going to be able to have that critical distance from which you can critique it and denaturalize it. And that's where comedians step in. They possess that unique ability to look at their own culture as if they were an outsider to their own culture. So the work of comedians and anthropologists both involve that capacity to stand outside of themselves. Comedians come to view their own culture in the same way an anthropologist approaches a foreign culture. Anthropologists typically study extinct cultures, whereas stand-up comedians study living cultures. They both reveal the underlying habits and thoughts and functions of that culture. The comedian witnesses or reads our socially enacted patterns of behaviors and points them out to us, usually exaggerating their observations or communicating them in a way using various rhetorical strategies so that their fellow members of society can see things the way the comic sees them. And these rhetorical strategies include the tone of voice, the shifting pitches, pacing, body languages, pauses, a lot of those conversation elements we've discussed previously. And unlike anthropologists who must maintain a scientific tone of emotionally distanced objectivity, comics can harness emotions of themselves and emotions of the audience and employ those rhetorical strategies and exaggerate their observations about cultural conventions and behaviors for the sake of inducing a humorous reaction. Comedians are very perceptive. They can read people and situations and then communicate their experience to an audience in a way that's relatable and funny and usually prompts the audience to think, huh, I never looked at it that way before. It really do be like that, don't it? Comedians make visible the aspects of our culture that have so far been unspoken, invisible, and tacitly accepted instead of explicitly stated, despite these aspects of our culture affecting our habits and institutions and thought patterns and behaviors and interactions in everyday lives. Understanding a people's sense of humor is one key to the structure of that society, its norms and customs and values, and its unspoken but tacitly accepted ideas and rules. Because a lot of our informally learned behaviors and unstated ideas are invisible to us, they need to be redefined so that their implications to society are fully seen by us and acknowledged and understood. Stand-up comedians cut out a piece of society for the audience to inspect and set up a frame in which the ideas and behaviors and symbols that are at play in that sectioned off part of society can be scrutinized and perhaps changed. And comedians primarily draw their material from their own experiences as the basis for their observations. That's why the comedy industry has a slightly better gender and ethnic representation amongst comedians than most other industries, because female Canadian comedians, for example, are more acutely aware of the power structures that obstruct equality in a male-dominated society. So they're better equipped to point out the disadvantages conferred upon women in society. The same thing with people of varying ethnic backgrounds who have experienced discrimination on the basis of their skin color. They can make this inequality visible to the audience members who may be too privileged to see it in their own everyday lives. Comedians take something that's so ingrained as an assumed constant in life and render it visible to suddenly make people aware of what's been staring them in the face this whole time. Comedians hold up a mirror to society and say, see, this is what you're like, for people to see themselves as they are. Comedians point out how nonsensical a lot of our customs and conventions that we hold as rational and natural actually are in society. So they expose our perspective to the things about ourselves and our society that we may not consciously realize or ever really reflect on. So comedians jar the audience's sensibilities and make them experience a shock of recognition. Deeply held popular beliefs about themselves and their culture are brought to the audience's level of conscious awareness, where previously it was operating at an unconscious level. The audience may hear their own behavior described to them as if it were an alien culture, in the sense that they knew that information all along, but no one ever said it like that to them before. Comedians, either through experience or training over time or just natural ability, natural inclination, are able to survey our social behaviors, so gender roles, for example, and uncover the biased knowledge and assumptions upon which those social behaviors are founded, and to construct an explanation form that classifies and conveys all the elements of that human experience. So, for example, gender roles to fellow members of their culture in ways that will spark a revelation in the mind. The audience members suddenly recognize themselves in the situation being described by the comedian, thus getting the audience to share or at least empathize with the comedian's depicted picture of reality. So we can demonstrate the social role of stand-up comedians by watching an excerpt from a stand-up comedy routine from the comic Patrice O'Neal. You may know Patrice, you may recognize him as an extra from The Office or Arrested Development, but he's so much more than that. He's one of the most brilliant comedic minds I've ever had the pleasure and privilege of listening to. I know him primarily from his radio appearances, which have been thankfully archived online on YouTube for anyone to peruse. Just hundreds of countless hours of Patrice O'Neal nuggets of wisdom. Not just hilarious, but also so socially biting and incisive. And like I said on the previous slide, he just describes things in a way that make me think, oh, I never thought of it that way before. But there's some truth to it. Unfortunately, he died young, and the world has been robbed of the decades extra we should have had of Patrice O'Neal. And the world and our current culture sorely needs his kind of perspective. So let's watch about 5 minutes from his last stand-up special before he passed away.
I'm glad y'all here. It's very good. Yo, congratulations to you, my friend. Look at that white woman you're with. God damn. You know how you can tell how pretty a white woman is? The value, you look at her and then you wonder how long they would look for if she was missing. I I saw you look mad, sweetie. How long, if you was missing, how long you think they were? How long you think they were? Exactly. She went. You know the deal. I ain't saying nothing wrong. White woman's life is valuable. What's his name? Joran Vandersloot? Right? We find out he was a serial killer. Man, he kills women. That's what he do. He do it well. You know what I mean? We know the girl that he you know, supposedly had, what's the girl in Aruba? Natalie Holloway, right? But the one, he just killed the girl in Peru. What's her name? Exactly. Look how fast you said Natalie. You said Natalie. Natalie Holloway, that angel. Y'all said that like Family Feud. All right, name a white girl been missing for 5 years in Aruba. Natalie Holloway. Survey says. Name a Peruvian girl that was killed yesterday. What is that big head third world Peruvian bitch's name? It has to be Yoris or something goofy. Don't get mad at yourself. I gave it to you. You saw how fast you said Natalie Holloway. Diana Ross right here said Natalie. She knew her name. That white girl with Natalie Holloway.
Okay, so he's pointing out racial and gender inequalities. He's pointing out that the lives of people of color are devalued in our society. Like in Canada, for example, there are thousands of Indigenous women who have gone missing and murdered with little to no media attention. Whereas when one white girl goes missing, it's a national news story with a full-scale police search. So Patrice here is talking about the widespread apathy towards the lives and well-being of non-white people. And it's an effective way of conveying social commentary related to this issue. Note Patrice's strategy, his rhetorical strategy of call and response. He asked the crowd for the name of the white woman who went missing a few months ago, and they all remembered it. He called for their response, and they all responded by saying her name, Natalie Holloway. And then he asked for the name of the woman from Peru who went missing more recently, and no one could remember, causing them all to laugh. Now, the audience isn't laughing at the Peruvian woman who they couldn't remember. They're laughing at themselves and their own folly for recalling the murdered white woman's name so easily, but not remembering anything about a Latina woman who was murdered much more recently. The audience members laugh because in that moment of revelation, they suddenly recognize how biased their thinking has been without consciously realizing until it was pointed out in this very effective manner. It wouldn't be as effective to just tell someone that their thinking is unconsciously biased and that they devalue people of certain ethnicities. They would likely have a knee-jerk reaction of immediate denial and be like, what? No, I don't. But it's better to gradually and indirectly lead them to that conclusion through crowd work strategies such as call and response, and let them reach that conclusion on their own. It'll have so much more impact on them.